Mayor Pete appears to be distancing himself from some of his previous work. And also, how do Americans feel about socialism?
Team Rising is here to break it all down. Max Burns is a Democratic strategist and contributor over at the Daily Beast, and Phil Wegman is a national political reporter for Real Clear Politics. Welcome to the show, guys. How are you?
Gentlemen.
Okay, so we've got some very interesting new pollings from the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. They have partnered with YouGov to do some very detailed polling about socialism. We talked a little bit about this earlier in the show. U.S. millennial attitudes towards socialism. They have 50% saying somewhat likely to vote for a socialist candidate. 20% say extremely likely to vote for a socialist candidate. I mean, Phil, effectively 70% of the millennial generation is saying they are likely in some way to vote for somebody who is a socialist. What do you ascribe a lot of this to? What do you think?
I think that this is a product of the success of Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. They're quickly, to borrow a terrible phrase, making socialism great again in this regard. And what we see here is that this socialism used to be a bad word not long ago in the political consciousness. Now you have these candidates who are openly saying that they're democratic socialists. And this is coming at a moment when even when the economy is doing well, millennials, they don't remember the sort of Red Scare history, and so they're much more open to this type of government.
Well, the economy's not doing that well for them.
Right. Well, that, and then at the same time, you've had, I mean, Republicans have called every Democrat a socialist. They called freaking Obama a socialist, which, like, I wish, right? And so the word just starts to lose its meaning, and you look at someone like Bernie Sanders, who's like, yeah, I'm a socialist, and people are like, oh, he wants to give me health care. This is not so scary.
Yeah, in a world where Mitt Romney is now a socialist, it's a world where the word socialism doesn't have any meaning.
Right.
But what this shows is it really expands on a survey done a couple months ago, too, by the Wall Street Journal, that shows that in a lot of things, millennials are very traditionally American. They want to have families. They want to buy homes. They're not able to do that because of student debt, because of jobs that don't pay wages that are sustainable.
Or benefits.
And then you see
housing costs,
exactly,
all of that.
And then you see the candidates like Bernie Sanders, like Elizabeth Warren, proposing numbers-based solutions that are decried as socialist. But millennials can do the math, and they see that these proposals are much better for them than the current system.
We've got an interesting other graphic that shows favorable opinion of the term socialism by generation, if we could put that one up as well. Both Gen Z and millennials have a fair amount of, you know, they're cool with the term socialism, et cetera. Millennials, though, are a bit more favorable towards the term than Gen Z, and then as you go forward in the generations, people become less and less comfortable with it. Also interesting, there has been a little bit of a dip, Max, from year over year in terms of favorable opinion of that word itself. What do you make of all that?
I think this is another branding exercise, essentially. And the smart thing that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has done is really emphasize the democratic part of democratic socialism. It moves it away from this idea that it's just a pathway to a totalitarian, authoritarian, communist government, and puts it more in the line of Canada and Europe and countries that people go to visit to relax and get away from stress.
Right. I would say, Phil, I mean, I look at this, and look, I've said this earlier in the show, I don't want to live in a socialist country. I don't agree with democratic socialism, but I understand why a lot of these people feel this way, which is that the attitudes, first of all, of course, the Cold War is over. But really what it is about, they look at something and they're like, look, we just want like a semi-equitable society here. We're not asking for quite a bit. And then you have, you know, somebody at the Chamber of Commerce who's like, no, that's socialism. That's going to turn us into Venezuela. So it really is a balance on the right in order to set the terms going forward. If you want to combat socialism, which I do, and I think a lot of the people on the right too. What do you think?
I mean, the same opportunities, to your point earlier, are not available to younger people. And while, you know, GDP is going up, that number doesn't immediately translate into a better life for a lot of individuals.
No, it doesn't.
And who should this scare the most? This should scare the Trump campaign the most, because their game plan is that whoever wins the Democratic nomination, whoever walks out of Milwaukee, whether it's Bernie Sanders or someone who is more moderate, they are going to label them as a democratic socialist from day one, and argue that all of these policies that have been discussed, that they are the standard bearer for them. So that works if you're only going after those older voters. It doesn't work to call a candidate a socialist when you're trying to compete for younger voters, like we just saw in the polling you put on the screen.
I think that's well said, and especially because it misunderstands the appeal of Trump himself, right? Part of why people like Trump is because he felt radical, because he said the things you weren't supposed to say. So then if you're trying to say, well, this political ideology is out of bounds, I think it's a failed strategy. And also, look, if you're debating socialism, you're debating economics. And that is where Democrats are the strongest, frankly.
Yeah, and we've seen what happens when a party is paternalistic and condescending about the ideology of their opponent. We've also seen what happens when a party nominates someone that the base is not excited about. And democratic socialism, these progressive policies are where the base is right now, not just among millennials, but among broad swaths of the Democratic Party.
Well, you've given me a great segue into Mayor Pete. There's a new piece in Politico about how, so part of his resume, and really sort of like a core part of his identity since he's burst onto the political scene, is as this like analytical policy wonk who was formed at the elite breeding ground of McKinsey Consulting. I actually did a piece on this a while ago on McKinsey's incredibly checkered history, the types of companies and people and countries they're willing to work with. I mean, just as a couple of examples, Purdue Pharma, which hoisted OxyContin and helped create one of the worst addiction crises in our nation history. Saudi Arabia, I mean, they're mercenaries for hire around the globe.
The Chinese in Xinjiang literally threw a party a couple of miles away from a concentration camp in the middle of China.
Yes, exactly. So this was a formative part of Pete's resume, bio, and his person. Well, now he has taken McKinsey off of his bio, and he now just says businessman. Phil, what do you think of this?
Yeah, I think it's funny. It also shows the evolution of Mayor Pete. He burst onto the scene back during the Tea Party era in Indiana when he was challenging the Republican incumbent for the state treasurer seat. And he argued, hey, I'm a young guy, but I understand business and economics because I was trained at McKinsey. It was a centerpiece of his pitch. And now it's completely different. He sort of wants to move away from that because, you know, on a national stage, people are going to be asking questions about what happened there. And so far, I think that because there are so many candidates in the field, we've sort of glossed over this one. But if he is to become the nominee or if he becomes a running mate, this is something that we're not going to ignore. And non-disclosure agreements that he may or may not have signed, well, those will be damned.
Well, I've said, you know, he's a neoliberal shapeshifter on the show, which is he basically started off as McKinsey guy, pro-business, Tea Party. Then he was a progressive for a little bit while, and now he's back in the middle and attacking Elizabeth Warren. Nobody knows where the hell this guy actually stands. And I mean, one thing, Max, is apparently on his resume was he worked on war zone economic development. Now, I'm willing to bet that there's some shady stuff that was going on there, or maybe something that wouldn't necessarily look good. Overall, I mean, does it make any sense to the Democrats to put somebody in high national office who worked for a Fortune 500 consulting firm that does business with authoritarian regimes around the world?
Yeah, and honestly, I think this is very much a flash in the pan story. I don't think it plays with voters in Iowa who are interested in talking about policies. And Pete Buttigieg has plenty of policies to talk about. I think if you go into rural communities in the Midwest and in the South, they're not going to understand immediately what McKinsey is.
But see, here's where I think, I was going to say, this is where, I mean, Obama ran his entire re-elect on demonizing Romney and Bain Capital. I think rightly so. I mean, you remember those guys who came out and said, look, you know, they had us build this stage so that they could go up on it and tell us we lost our jobs. I mean, that stuff
brutal,
was
man.
Devastating.
And McKinsey does the same thing.
And McKinsey does the same thing.
So I think that the difference right now is that Pete Buttigieg was not an executive like Mitt Romney was at Bain Capital. Clearly, he was a junior person. He wasn't there for that long. But the same courtesy.
He's like, I didn't have that kind of power.
I doubt the same courtesy would have been afforded to, you know, Mitt Romney or someone else. I mean, these are issues that I think that actually did very much resonate with voters in 2012. It was called the Bain Capital Offensive for a reason. You saw Joe Biden out there day in, day out in Iowa, in Ohio, in New Hampshire, going after Romney because of the business dealings of Bain Capital. And again, it's going to be to a different degree. But Buttigieg is going to have to come up with a better answer other than, I'm just a businessman.
Just a businessman.
Bin Laden is dead and GM is alive. They shouted that from the damn rooftops during that election.
All right, stick with us, guys. We got more right after this.